In awakening, the mask you wore for society, the persona, is stripped away. This mask, carefully constructed through years of conditioning, was the very engine of your ambitions. It wanted to be successful, admired, respected. When it falls, so too does the borrowed desire it carried. What remains is the silence of your true self, unmotivated by illusion. In the aftermath of a spiritual awakening, one of the first and most unsettling shifts is the sudden loss of ambition, the evaporating hunger for progress, and the quiet collapse of everything one once strove for. This is not a temporary dip in motivation or a burnout caused by exhaustion. It is the implosion of something more fundamental, the persona. For much of our lives, we wear a mask, though we seldom recognize it as such. The persona is the socially constructed identity we present to the world. It is how we fit in, how we're rewarded, how we are recognized. It is the version of ourselves shaped by family expectations, cultural norms, career aspirations, and the need for approval. It speaks in shoulds and musts and acts like a bridge between the inner world and society. But this persona is not the self. It is a tool, an actor on the stage of life. An awakening shows us that we are not the role, but the silent witness behind it. This realization can be disorienting. When the mask falls, all the desires and ambitions that once energized us go with it. If the persona was built to gain status, then success in a job once felt like oxygen. If it was shaped to be admired, then social validation was its heartbeat. But now, standing apart from this mask, we can no longer summon the same enthusiasm for the things it once cared for. What used to feel meaningful now feels like theater. The applause no longer satisfies. The race no longer calls. This is not depression. It is the psyche reclaiming itself. The outward drive collapses because it was never truly yours. It belonged to the persona, a carefully constructed fiction you unconsciously believed in. Once that fiction dissolves, the scaffolding of your life begins to fall away with it. This is a kind of psychological death, but it is also a birth. For when the persona falls, what remains is raw and unshaped. You begin to glimpse the authentic self, not the version engineered for approval or success, but the quiet, observing core that has no agenda beyond truth. This core does not perform, does not seek to impress, does not strive to become anything other than what it already is. But therein lies the tension. The world still expects performance. Responsibilities remain, but the old engine no longer functions. You cannot go back to pretending because the illusion is no longer convincing. You have seen behind the curtain. This state can be deeply unsettling, even frightening. Without the old mask, who are you? Without the drive to achieve, what is your value? These questions emerge like echoes in a silent canyon. The temptation is to scramble back, to rebuild the old persona, to return to goals and behaviors that once gave structure. But the soul resists. It refuses to move backward. And so you are left in limbo, a space between identities, between stories, between masks. The collapse of the persona strips away not only your ambitions, but also your sense of purpose. This is where many begin to feel lost. But what is truly happening is a sacred reordering. What was false must fall so what is real can arise. The lack of drive is not a deficiency, it is a purification. It is the clearing of psychic space so that something more honest can grow. This emptiness, this stillness, is not a void but a womb yet. The world does not honor this process. It sees the lack of ambition as weakness, the absence of goals as failure. But from the inner perspective, this phase is necessary. You cannot serve two masters, the persona and the self, and once the self has awakened, it will not tolerate lies. It will not lend its energy to a mask. So the persona dies, and with it, the compulsive drive that once animated your every move, leaving you standing in a stillness that feels unfamiliar and sacred. The ego, long mistaken for the totality of the self, stands at the center of ordinary consciousness, tirelessly organizing the world around a singular premise, I am. It charts direction, accumulates achievements, constructs identity, and measures worth by comparison, competition, and control. From childhood, it is trained to believe in the necessity of becoming more intelligent, more attractive, more successful. It acts as the manager of life, pushing and pulling according to what it believes will ensure safety, recognition, and superiority. But in the wake of a spiritual awakening, something profound and irreversible occurs. The ego is no longer enthroned as the unquestioned ruler. Its narratives begin to unravel, its voice loses authority, and its obsessions appear increasingly absurd. The awakening reveals that the I, it so fiercely defended, is not the entirety of who you are but merely a sliver, a surface-level identity floating above vast and uncharted depths. What follows is not a smooth surrender, but a disorienting upheaval. The ego, sensing its dethronement, resists with subtle and overt tactics. It may attempt to reassert control through new spiritual goals, trying to turn awakening into another form of status or superiority. It may whisper that your sudden disinterest in worldly pursuits is laziness or failure. It may plead for a return to the old drives, to build, to achieve, to become something again. But underneath this desperation is the dawning realization that the scaffolding it built was never meant to last. It was always a provisional structure, a temporary construct meant to help you function in the outer world, not to serve as the foundation of your inner truth. The loss of drive is not simply the result of exhaustion or apathy. It is the result of recognizing that the very structure of motivation, once tethered to the ego's fantasies, has dissolved. When the ego believed that wealth or prestige or mastery could finally secure love or happiness, it generated immense energy to pursue those ends. But once it is seen that these pursuits were hollow promises, the engine stalls. What is there to chase when the mirage is revealed? What mountains are worth climbing when their summits only offer more emptiness masked as triumph? The ego's goals are exposed as circular: climb, conquer, consume, repeat. Without the illusion of lasting fulfillment, the drive disappears not out of weakness, but out of clarity. This clarity is not immediately comfortable. In fact, it is often felt as a kind of mourning. The ego thrived on urgency. It told you there was no time to waste, that your worth depended on perpetual movement. Now, in the stillness that follows its collapse, the psyche begins to grieve. There is grief for the years spent chasing what never mattered, for the roles played and masks worn, for the effort poured into constructing an identity that now feels irrelevant. But alongside the grief is an emerging freedom. You are no longer beholden to the ego's compulsions. You are no longer trapped in the exhausting loop of becoming someone. You are, for the first time, beginning to simply be. However, this new state of being is not immediately energizing. It is not productive in the ways society values. There is no checklist, no ladder, no finish line. The old structure of drive collapses with the ego, and the new one, if it is to arise, must be rooted in something deeper than achievement. It must arise not from fear or comparison, but from an authentic alignment with inner truth. But until that new orientation stabilizes, the psyche remains in a kind of sacred suspension. Drive does not vanish, it waits. It waits for the moment when it can serve something real. The ego once generated energy through desire and fear, but now the self waits to move from intuition, depth, and meaning, which do not obey the timelines or measures of the outer world. The dethronement of the ego is not the end of vitality, but the end of coercion, and in the silence that follows, a new kind of life begins to stir, still wordless, still shapeless, but irreversibly free from the tyrant that once demanded you prove your worth by running faster toward illusions. that were never meant to hold your soul. After the rupture of awakening, the world does not look the same, and more importantly, it does not feel the same. The structures, systems, and pursuits that once gave your life meaning begin to dissolve before your eyes, not because they have changed, but because your perception of them has. What you once called meaning is now revealed to have been externally inherited, absorbed from culture, tradition, media, and the expectations of others. It was a borrowed framework, unquestioned, embedded so deeply in your psyche that it felt like your own. You believed success meant recognition, that purpose meant productivity, that happiness meant the possession of certain things or the achievement of particular milestones. But after awakening, these constructs lose their persuasive power. The curtain has been pulled back, and the stage on which you performed for so long no longer calls you to act. This disintegration of external meaning is not subtle, it is seismic. Things that once sparked passion or urgency, career goals, reputation, competition, social climbing, begin to appear empty, like ghostly rituals performed by people still entranced by the play. It is not that these pursuits are evil or wrong, but that they no longer resonate with the frequency of your newly expanded awareness. You see through them. You see how they were designed to keep the ego engaged, distracted, constantly reaching for validation and security outside itself. The meaning they once held was conditional and transactional, based on approval, performance, or accumulation. Now, in the light of awakening, these conditions appear shallow. You no longer believe that meaning can be manufactured through metrics or imposed through systems. This collapse can feel destabilizing because the psyche craves structure, even if that structure is built on illusion. We are conditioned to measure our value through our usefulness, our contributions, our impact on the external world. When those measurements dissolve, you may feel aimless, untethered, even invisible. You are no longer playing the game, and the game, in turn, no longer recognizes you. This exile from familiar meaning does not mean your life has no purpose. It means the old sources of purpose have been exposed as insufficient. And in their absence, a deeper search begins, not outwardly but inwardly, not through striving but through listening. But in this space of silence, something paradoxical happens. What once felt like a crisis of meaning becomes a gateway to authenticity. No longer seduced by collective ideals, you begin to ask a more difficult question: what is truly meaningful to me? Not what I have been told should matter, not what others admire, but what feels aligned with the core of my being, even if it looks like nothing to the outside world. This shift is radical because it detaches meaning from validation. You are not pursuing a sense of worth from the outside, you are discovering it from within, and often this discovery happens slowly, subtly, without fireworks or applause. It might take the shape of simple moment, stillness, honesty, creating something for the sake of beauty rather than outcome, helping someone without needing to be seen. This is not the end of meaning. It is the end of artificial meaning. And in that ending, there is a freedom that cannot be understood by the ego, because true meaning is not loud, it is not a spotlight, it is a quiet resonance, a feeling of inner congruence that does not depend on reward. You are no longer interested in being impressive, because you are no longer fragmented. You are no longer obsessed with significance, because you are no longer separate from life itself. The need to be somebody is replaced with the joy of being nobody in particular, and in that emptiness, a fuller kind of life begins to take root, not dictated from above, but growing naturally from the ground of your own unconditioned awareness as the structures of ego and persona dissolve in aftermath of spiritual awakening. What begins to rise is not clarity, not peace, not a new vision of purpose, but something much darker, heavier, and unexpected. It is the emergence of what had been hidden, repressed, denied for years, what some call the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of the psyche that has been cast out of conscious awareness, because it did not align with the persona or the idealized version of self that the ego has carefully maintained. Before awakening, the energy of the shadow is manageable because the ego is fully occupied with chasing goals, building identity, and maintaining control. But when the ego collapses or is bypassed by awakening, the doors to the unconscious swing open, and what steps forward is everything that was once avoided. This rising of the shadow often manifests first as emotional heaviness, a strange and sudden sense of emptiness, apathy, confusion, or even despair. These are not signs of something going wrong. They are the first indicators that the deeper layers of the psyche are moving to the surface. They speak in moods rather than words, in symbols rather than logic. And they are not comfortable because they do not obey the spiritual ego's desire for constant light and transcendence. In fact, they are the very parts of you that were left behind in the pursuit of light. They are the wounds, the unmet needs, the unexpressed grief, the rage, the loneliness, and the fears that were buried so deeply that you forgot they were even there in many ways. This phase is more difficult than the awakening itself. The awakening shatters illusion and grants a glimpse of truth, but the integration of the shadow forces you to walk into the underworld of your own being. The drive disappears not because you have failed, but because your energy is now being redirected inward, toward territory that requires attention, compassion, and courage. You are no longer building your life outwardly. You are descending into the architecture of your inner world, into the caves and corridors where long, forgotten fragments of self are waiting to be reclaimed during this time. You may feel as though you are regressing, losing interest in everything that once mattered. The surface of life feels gray, uninspiring. Social roles become exhausting. Creative energy vanishes. Even spiritual practices feel hollow. This is the descent, and it is sacred. The psyche has called back its projections. The world no longer reflects what it once did because the inner material is being reshuffled, unearthed, and rewritten. And in this reshuffling, all the tidy categories of good and bad, successful and failed, spiritual and unspiritual begin to blur. You are meeting yourself not as an idea, but as a totality, and that totality includes everything: your brilliance and your shame, your compassion and your cruelty, your clarity and your confusion. This confrontation with the shadow is not a punishment. It is a rite of passage. It marks the shift from spiritual romanticism to psychological reality. It strips away the fantasy that awakening is only bliss, that enlightenment is escape. It reveals that true liberation comes not by rising above the shadow, but by turning toward it, sitting with it, listening to it without judgment. And in this act of turning inward, your energy, once wasted on external validation or avoidance, begins to return. Slowly, something new starts to take root, not a drive to prove yourself, not a motivation to become anything in particular, but a quiet commitment to wholeness. You begin to feel a different kind of energy rising, one that is not frantic or desperate, but grounded, steady, honest. This energy does not come from the ego or the persona. It comes from the integration of what was once fragmented, and in this integration, you begin to feel less like someone trying to become, and more like someone finally allowed to be all that they are without needing to hide or explain. What appears on the surface as a loss of ambition or motivation after spiritual awakening is, on a deeper level, a radical withdrawal of psychic energy from its former investments. This energy, which has historically been referred to as libido, not in the narrow sexual sense, but as the total life force of the psyche, once flowed outward into socially sanctioned structures, ambitions, identities, and desires. It was the force that pushed the ego toward goals, that fueled dreams of success, mastery, or romance, that kept the personality animated and focused on future outcomes. But after awakening, this same energy begins to recede from the external world. It no longer rushes toward status or accumulation. It no longer fuels the narratives of self-improvement or self-importance. It does not disappear, but it retracts like a tide, pulling back into the depths from which it first emerged. This retraction is not a choice made by the will. It is not the result of apathy or failure. It is the psyche's natural response to seeing through the illusions that once captivated it. When the foundational beliefs that once structured your reality collapse, when success, recognition, or productivity no longer seem meaningful, the energy that once sustained those pursuits cannot continue to flow into them. The psyche knows when something is false, and once it knows, it refuses to pour life into what it no longer trusts. This creates a strange and often unsettling sensation. You are alive, but unmoved, awake, but unmotivated, aware, yet directionless. The structures that once shaped your days no longer compel you to act. The goals that once defined your identity no longer offer any promise of fulfillment. This phase can feel like a standstill, like a deep and prolonged pause that you cannot force your way out of. The modern world, built on speed and productivity, has little tolerance for such states. It will try to label this stillness as laziness, burnout, or even pathology. But from within the awakened psyche, it is none of these things. It is an act of energetic honesty. It is the refusal of the soul to keep playing games it no longer believes in. You may try to revive your old ambitions, to reattach to the frameworks of progress and performance, but the effort feels hollow. You can pretend, but you cannot believe, and without belief, the energy will not follow. What once motivated you now rings empty. What once made sense now feels artificial. This is the reorientation of libido, and it cannot be rushed in this space of withdrawal. Something begins to change beneath the surface. As the energy no longer flows outward in automatic patterns, it begins to gather, to accumulate, to spiral inward. And in that inward spiral, it begins to move toward a different center, not the ego, with its craving for control and admiration, but the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche that does not speak in goals, but in symbols, dreams, and intuitive knowing. The self does not demand action for the sake of visibility. It asks for alignment. It waits for silence. It moves not with pressure, but with precision. And so the energy that once sustained frantic striving begins to attune to something slower, deeper, more rooted. It waits for authenticity before it moves. This new movement of energy does not often come with fireworks or bold ambition. It may emerge as a quiet pull towards something you cannot explain, a need to create, to listen, to rest, to walk away, to begin again with no clear destination. This is the first sign that the libido is finding its new direction, not toward the maintenance of persona or the inflation of ego, but toward wholeness, toward coherence. It is the soul's way of reclaiming its own power, refusing to act on anything that is not in integrity with what you now know to be true. And until such a foundation is found, the energy will continue to resist externalization, not because it is absent, but because it is waiting for you to remember how to live without betraying yourself in the silent wake of spiritual awakening. What many experience is not a triumphant clarity, but a strange and disorienting stillness, as though the inner machinery that once kept life in motion has gone quiet. This stillness is not the same as peace, although it may look like it from the outside. It is more like an emptying out, a cessation of movement that feels unfamiliar and at times unnerving. The structures of identity have crumbled, the projections have been recalled, and the compulsive grasping for purpose or validation has subsided, not because these things have been solved or achieved, but because they no longer compel. What rises in this space is not always bliss or enlightenment, but something closer to raw presence, a state that the ego cannot manage or make use of. And so the old drives fade not by force, but by irrelevance. This experience is often mistaken for depression or defeat because it shares certain surface features: withdrawal, lack of motivation, a retreat from social life. but its root is entirely different. Depression comes from a sense of loss, failure, or hopelessness, but what occurs here is a release of false striving. It is not the soul that is heavy, but the ego that is disappointed, disarmed, uncertain of what to do without its usual tools of becoming. The personality, once so occupied with building, improving, achieving, finds itself without direction, as if waiting for instructions that never come. Yet something in this waiting feels necessary, as though the next movement must not come from habit, but from a deeper source that refuses to be hurried or manipulated. This refusal is not passive, it is active in its stillness. It is the soul protecting its integrity, ensuring that no energy is wasted on paths that no longer serve its evolution. Before awakening, the psyche was engaged in a continuous act of performance, becoming who it thought it needed to be, chasing what it was told to want, hiding what it feared would not be accepted. But after awakening, the performative self begins to collapse, and with it, the endless movement driven by comparison, fear, and insecurity. What replaces this movement is not immediately action, but silence. A pause, a deep and necessary incubation in which the psyche reorients itself to a new center during this time. It is common to feel as though one is floating in between worlds, no longer part of the old, not yet anchored in the new. The outer world continues its pace, demanding clarity, contribution, consistency, but the inner world moves according to entirely different laws. It values truth over speed, depth over productivity, essence over performance. And so there arises a tension between what is expected and what is true. You may find yourself unable to comply with demands that once felt reasonable. You may struggle to explain this to others or even to yourself, because there is no language that can fully capture why the old ways no longer work. All you can know is that something in you refuses to betray itself again. This inner refusal is not an obstacle. It is the beginning of integrity. It is how the deeper self signals that it is ready to live without compromise, that it no longer consents to serving narratives it does not believe in. But the world rarely celebrates this kind of transformation. It prefers visible progress, measurable growth, tangible results. It does not know how to hold space for a soul in transition, for a being who is learning how to live from truth rather than compulsion. And so this phase can feel lonely, even invisible. But invisibility can be a kind of grace, a protective cocoon in which something fragile is forming that cannot yet be named. Eventually, when the time is right, the stillness begins to move not with urgency, but with certainty. You begin to act again, but from a different place, not from need or fear, not from image or pressure, but from alignment. The movement is slower, perhaps, and less glamorous, but it is real. It does not exhaust you, because it does not require you to be anyone other than who you are. This is the new drive, not a return to the ambitions of the past, but a subtle and sacred pull toward what is honest, whole, and quietly alive within you. So, why do you have no drive left after spiritual awakening? Because the old world has died, because what once motivated you was never yours to begin with, because your soul, having glimpsed truth, refuses to serve falsehood. This is not laziness, this is not failure. This is the sacred dormancy of winter before the spring of the authentic self. Let it be, let the silence teach you, and when drive returns, it will no longer be a fire that burns you out, but a light that leads you home. Thank you.